The iron pry bar bit into the mortar with a gritty screech, the sound of a thing being undone. Elias Thorne, all of 19 years and built of little more than sinew and resolve, put his weight into the tool. Dust, thick with the ghosts of 100 winter's fires, billowed into the cold cabin air, coating his hair and the back of his neck in a fine gray powder. A block of fieldstone, heavy as a man's torso and black with soot, shifted with a groan and tumbled onto the worn plank floor. It landed with a solid, final thud that seemed to shake the small structure to its foundation. Borrow, a lanky hound of indeterminate breeding and profound patience, lifted his head from his paws, his brown eyes tracking the falling stone. He gave a low whine, not of fear, but of weary inquiry. Elias coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. "It has to be done," he said, his voice quiet, swallowed by the cavernous space the hearth had once filled. Borrow rested his head back down, a silent acceptance of the strange work. For a week, this had been their rhythm. Elias would wrestle with the old fireplace, a monstrous, inefficient thing that consumed wood with voracious appetite and gave back a paltry, smoky warmth. And Borrow would watch, a steadfast shadow in the growing chill of late autumn. The cabin had been his parents'. Now it was just his. The emptiness was a physical presence, a cold draft that the old fireplace had never been able to fight. His father's journal lay open on the small pine table, its pages filled with a spidery, methodical script and precise, intricate drawings. It was a book of strange ideas, of observations on the movement of heat and air that no one else in the valley seemed to understand. One entry, circled twice, was the genesis of this dusty demolition. Heat the mass, not the air. A stone that is warm will warm you all night. A room full of hot air is a thief, always seeking a way out. The work was brutal. He hauled the stones outside one by one, his back screaming in protest, his hands raw and scraped. He stacked them near the woodpile, a monument to the past he was dismantling. By the end of the second week, all that remained of the great stone hearth was a gaping hole in the wall and a dark stain on the ceiling. It was then that Mr. Gable came by. He was their closest neighbor, a man whose 50 years in the valley were etched into the deep lines of his face. He'd known Elias since he was a boy and felt a certain proprietary concern for him, which often manifested as gruff, unsolicited advice. He stopped his horse, his eyes widening at the pile of soot-stained rocks. "Elias," he called out, his voice thick with disbelief. "What in God's name are you doing? Tearing out a perfectly good hearth before winter?" Elias wiped sweat and grime from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "It wasn't good, Mr. Gable. It wasted wood." Gable dismounted, walking closer to the cabin, peering inside at the raw, gaping hole. He shook his head, a slow, pitying motion. "Wasted wood? Son, that fireplace has seen this valley through 50 winters. Your father built it with his own hands, and you're tearing it down for what? Wait until the first real snow. Wait until the wind comes down off the ridge. That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. You'll freeze before the new year." "I have a plan," Elias said, his voice even. He did not point to the journal. He did not try to explain the principles of thermal mass or the J-shaped burn tunnel his father had sketched. Explanations felt like arguments, and he was not one for arguing. He preferred the simple logic of action. "A plan," Gable scoffed, turning back to his horse. He swung himself into the saddle. "Your plan had better involve a miracle. Don't come knocking on my door when your pipes are frozen solid." He rode off without another word, leaving a cloud of disapproval hanging in the cold air. Elias watched him go, then turned back to the cabin. Boro nudged his cold nose into his master's raw hand. Elias scratched the dog behind the ears, his gaze fixed on the empty space. "He's wrong," he murmured. "It'll work." The next phase of the work began at the creek. He needed clay, tons of it. He spent days digging it from the bank, the wet, heavy soil sucking at his shovel. He loaded it onto a crude wooden sledge he'd built and hauled it, load by agonizing load, back to the cabin. His shoulders burned, his legs ached, but with each trip, a foundational pile of gray, pliable earth grew beside his door. He mixed it with sand he'd carted from a deposit downriver and straw from last year's meager harvest, stomping it with his bare feet until the consistency was perfect. It was ancient, elemental work, mud and straw, the stuff of the first houses. He started the core with the fire bricks his father had carefully stored in the lean-to, precious and expensive. He laid them with painstaking precision, forming the J-shaped channel from the journal. The firebox, small and vertical, was just 8 inches square. It connected to a horizontal burn tunnel 3 feet long before turning sharply upward for a short, 6-foot insulated chimney. This was the engine, the heart of the machine. It looked impossibly small, a fragile, skeletal thing inside the massive void of the old fireplace. Mrs. Albright stopped by next, a pot of warm venison stew in her hands. She was a kind woman, with a mother's worry for all the valley's children, and Elias, newly orphaned, was at the top of her list. Her eyes, however, were filled with the same confusion as Gable's. "Elias, dear," she said, her brow furrowed as she looked at the strange brick construction and the enormous pile of mud. "The stew will keep you warm for a night, but what will you do for heat? There's no time for this before the freeze." "This will be the heat, Mrs. Albright," he said, accepting the stew with a grateful nod. "That little thing?" She gestured at the firebox. "It's no bigger than a bread box. And what is all this mud for?" "For the bench," he replied. Her concern only deepened. She patted his arm, her expression a mixture of pity and affection. "You make sure you have enough blankets, you hear me? Your father was a dreamer, Elias. Don't let his dreams leave you cold." He ate the stew that night, Boro getting the last few scraps, the rich broth a welcome warmth in his belly. He read his father's words again. The fire must burn sideways. The heat must have a long road to travel before it escapes. Give it work to do. Make it warm the stone. His father had been a dreamer, yes, but his dreams were drafted with an engineer's precision. Elias felt no doubt. Only the heavy weight of the work still to be done. The bench was the mass. He began to build it around the horizontal burn tunnel, which he now wrapped in a length of 8-inch stovepipe. He packed the wet cob, the mixture of clay, sand, and straw, around the pipe, building it up layer by careful layer. Each layer was 6 inches thick. He would apply one, smooth it with his hands and a wet board, and then have to wait a day or two for it to firm up before adding the next. It was a slow, geological process. The bench grew outward from the wall, a thick, serpentine form, curving into the room. It was 3 feet wide and rose 2 feet off the floor. Days bled into weeks. The golden leaves of the aspens turned to brown lace and fell, leaving the trees stark and skeletal against a steel-gray sky. The air grew teeth. Frost silvered the cabin windows each morning. Elias worked relentlessly. His hands were permanently caked with dried clay, the skin cracked and bleeding at the knuckles. He would clean them each night, apply a salve his mother had made, and wake the next morning to plunge them back into the cold, wet mud. Boro would lie on the floor nearby, a silent partner in the toil, occasionally licking a bleeding knuckle with a warm, rough tongue. Mr. Sterling, who owned the largest ranch in the valley and considered himself its de facto patriarch, rode by one afternoon. He sat high on a magnificent black horse, looking down at Elias, who was sculpting the final curve of the bench. "A mud bench?" Sterling called out, his voice carrying an edge of amused contempt. "Boy, you'll freeze to death. My big cast-iron stove burns a cord of wood a month, and even that's barely enough to keep the chill out of my parlor. What do you think you're going to do with mud and a handful of twigs?" Elias didn't look up from his work. He ran his trowel along the smooth, damp curve. "It will hold the heat," he said quietly. Sterling laughed, a short barking sound. "It'll hold the cold, more like. It's a tomb, not a heater. Mark my words." He spurred his horse and cantered away. The bench was finished by the first week of November. It was a massive earthen sculpture dominating the small cabin, smooth and gray and solid. It felt ancient, like something unearthed rather than built. He connected the short insulated chimney from the burn chamber to the existing flue his father had built into the cabin's structure, sealing it tight with more cob and stove cement. The system was complete. It had taken him nearly 2 months of ceaseless labor. Outside, the world was poised for winter. The sky was heavy and low, the color of lead. The wind had a new, sharper edge to it, a promise of the bitterness to come. He spent the next 2 days splitting wood. Not the great logs he used to have to wrestle for the old fireplace, but small branches and scraps, nothing thicker than his wrist. He stacked the modest pile inside. It looked like kindling, not fuel for a winter. Then he waited. The air in the cabin was frigid. He could see his breath. Boro shivered in his sleep, curled into a tight ball. Elias wore his father's thick wool coat indoors. He felt the first prickle of doubt, a cold little seed planted by the chorus of skeptical voices. What if they were right? What if he had doomed himself and his only companion to freeze in a tomb of his own making? He pushed the thought away and looked at the journal. Trust the mass. On the 3rd day, the snow began. Not gentle flurries, but a hard, driving onslaught. Flakes as thick as goose down, driven by a wind that moaned around the corners of the cabin. The world outside the window dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The temperature plummeted. This was it, the first real snow. Gable's test. Elias took a deep breath. He crumpled a few pages from an old almanac, placed them in the small vertical firebox, and laid a handful of his smallest, driest twigs on top. He lit a match. The flame caught, bright and eager. He added a few more sticks, each no thicker than his thumb. He closed the heavy iron door of the firebox, leaving a small vent open at the bottom. For a moment, a puff of smoke escaped into the room. His heart sank. But then, as the fire intensified in the small insulated chamber, a new sound began. It was a low roar, a deep, resonant whoosh, like a distant waterfall. The smoke vanished. The draft had caught. The fire was being pulled sideways, into the burn tunnel, with incredible force. He looked at the chimney outside. There was no smoke, only a faint shimmering distortion in the air, a sign of the hot, clean gases escaping. He sat on the floor, watching, listening to the roar. He fed it 3 more small pieces of wood. The firebox glowed with an intense, white-hot heat, but the bench remained cold to the touch. An hour passed. The storm outside intensified, the wind shrieking like a predator. The cabin grew colder still. The seed of doubt began to sprout. Boro whined softly, pressing against his leg for warmth. "Just wait," Elias whispered, as much to himself as to the dog. He put his hand on the cob bench near the firebox. Nothing. It was as cold as a river stone. He felt a surge of despair. They had been right, all of them. He had built a beautiful, useless sculpture, a monument to his own folly. He resisted the urge to build a bigger fire, to stuff the box with wood. The journal had been clear: a small, hot fire. Feed it little and often for the first hour. He added 2 more sticks and sat back, resigned. He had failed. He had dishonored his father's knowledge and would likely pay the price. It was another hour before he felt it. He had slumped against the base of the bench, huddled in his coat, when a subtle warmth began to seep into his back. It was not the scorching, direct heat of a fire, but a gentle, pervasive warmth, like a sun-baked rock long after the sun has set. He pressed his palm flat against the surface. It was warm, definitely, undeniably warm. He moved his hand further down the bench, away from the firebox. Here, too, a gentle heat was radiating from the dense clay. He followed the path of the winding flue inside the bench with his hands. The entire massive structure was slowly, steadily drinking in the ferocious heat of the small fire and breathing it back out into the room. By evening, the handful of wood had burned to a bed of fine white ash. The roaring in the firebox had ceased, but the bench was a river of warmth flowing through the cabin. Elias took off his coat. Boro, sensing the change, uncurled himself and stretched out on the bench's broad surface, letting out a deep sigh of contentment. The air in the room was no longer frigid. The cold was in retreat, pushed back by the steady, radiant heat. The storm raged for 2 days. The snow piled up in monumental drifts, burying fences, swallowing the road. The world was a maelstrom of white and wind. Inside the small cabin, a quiet miracle was unfolding. Elias burned no more than an armful of small branches each morning and each evening. A tiny fire, roaring for an hour, was enough to keep the massive cob bench saturated with heat. The warmth it released was constant, gentle, and bone-deep. The windows were clear of frost. The temperature inside held at a comfortable 70 degrees, while outside it was well below 0. He had used less wood in 2 days of a blizzard than the old fireplace would have consumed in 3 hours of a mild evening. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind died down and the snow stopped. The silence was profound. The world was buried, pristine and white, under 4 feet of snow. It was in this silence that he heard the desperate, muffled pounding on his door. He pulled the door open, breaking a thick seal of snow. Mr. Gable stood there, his face gray with cold and exhaustion, his eyebrows and beard caked in ice. He was covered in snow, looking half frozen. "Elias," he stammered, his teeth chattering. "My chimney. The wind must have blocked it. The fire's out. The house. It's like an icebox. My wife, Martha, she's so cold." His eyes, full of desperation, fell upon Elias, standing in the doorway in nothing but his shirt sleeves. Gable's gaze drifted past him, into the warm, comfortable-looking cabin. He saw the dog sleeping peacefully on the strange mud bench. He blinked, his mind struggling to reconcile the sight with the brutal reality of the cold. Elias stepped back without a word, holding the door open. Gable stumbled inside, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. He stopped in the middle of the room, turning slowly, feeling the radiant warmth on his frozen face. He looked at the bench, then at the small firebox, now cold and dormant. He looked at the tiny pile of wood next to it. It didn't make sense. "How?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Your fire. It can't be lit." "It's not," Elias said. "I haven't lit it since last night." Gable reached out a trembling hand and touched the bench. He snatched it back as if burned, though the surface was only pleasantly, deeply warm. "It's the bench," he breathed, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. "The heat is in the bench." "Go get Martha," Elias said simply. "Bring her here." Gable didn't need to be told twice. He returned half an hour later, supporting his shivering wife. Elias settled her onto the warmest part of the bench, wrapping her in a thick wool blanket. The deep, steady warmth began to seep into her, and the violent shivering slowly subsided. They were not the only ones. Later that day, Mrs. Albright and her husband appeared, their own wood stove unable to compete with the sheer, penetrating cold. Then two of the Sterling ranch hands, their bunkhouse an ice-choked tomb. Elias's small cabin became a refuge. 6 people and a dog, sheltered from the blizzard's aftermath. They sat on the bench or near it, soaking in the impossible warmth. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes continually drawn to the earthen structure that had saved them. They ate the last of Mrs. Albright's stew and some of Elias's dried meat, sharing what little there was. And the bench, a silent, generous host, continued to radiate its stored heat through the day and into the night. When the thaw finally came and the paths were cleared, the visitors left, their bodies warm, their minds filled with a profound and unsettling wonder. Mr. Gable was the last to leave. He stood at the door, twisting his hat in his hands, a man humbled. "I was wrong, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He wouldn't meet Elias's eyes. "I was a fool. What I said to you, I'm sorry. Your father, he was a clever man, a genius. He just paid attention," Elias said. "Will you," Gable finally looked up, "will you show me? The journal? I want to build one. For Martha." Elias nodded. "I'll help you." That spring, they dug clay from the creek bed together. Elias shared his father's journal, explaining the diagrams, the ratios of sand to clay, the critical importance of the insulated J-channel. Gable, a man who had built his life with his hands, listened with the rapt attention of a student. They built a heater in Gable's home, a large bench that curved around his existing hearth. When they lit the first fire and the gentle, enduring warmth began to fill the room, Martha Gable cried with relief. Word spread through the valley, no longer as a tale of a fool boy's folly, but as a legend of salvation. Mr. Sterling, whose grand house had suffered 3 burst pipes and whose wood bill was astronomical, came by, not on his high horse, but on foot. He stood before Elias, his arrogance stripped away by the hard lessons of the blizzard. "Thorne," he said, the name now uttered with a respect it had never before commanded. "I need one. I'll pay you whatever you ask." "I don't want your money," Elias said, "but I'll teach you, and you'll teach your men." And so the knowledge spread. Elias became an unlikely teacher, his quiet cabin a school. He didn't lecture, he worked alongside them, showing them how to mix the cob, how to form the channels, how to listen for the roar of a clean, efficient burn. That summer, the valley was filled with the strange sight of men and women digging for clay, mixing mud, and building massive sculptural benches inside their homes. They were monuments to a shared vulnerability and a newfound wisdom. The next winter was different. The valley was warmer. The woodpiles were smaller. The fear of the cold had lessened its grip. Among those who came to learn was Sarah, Mrs. Albright's niece, who had returned to the valley to help her aunt. She did not stand back and watch. She tucked her skirt up and waded into the mud pit, her hands learning the feel of the cob. She asked questions, not of doubt, but of genuine curiosity, about the heat, the flow, the way the mass held the energy. She looked at the drawings in the journal, not as strange scribbles, but as a language she wanted to understand. Her presence was a quiet warmth of a different kind, one that settled in Elias's chest and stayed there. They spoke little, but they worked together, a comfortable rhythm developing between them. The years passed as seasons do, each turning into the next with a steady, unhurried grace. Elias and Sarah married in the small valley church. They had children, a boy and a girl, who grew up in the little cabin, for whom the warm, earthen bench was the center of their world. It was where they were warmed as newborns, where they learned to walk, where they listened to stories on cold winter nights, their backs pressed against the steady, comforting heat. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned gray. His steps became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping on his favorite spot on the bench, the place where the warmth was most gentle. One winter morning, when Elias went to light the fire, he found the old dog lying peacefully in his usual spot. He was still, and the warmth beneath him was from the bench alone. Elias carried his old friend, his first and most steadfast believer, outside and buried him beneath the great oak tree on the hill overlooking the cabin. He carved a simple B into the bark. He did not weep, but a profound quietness settled over him that day, the feeling of a chapter, long and good, coming to its close. Elias himself grew old. His hair turned the color of winter frost, and his hands, which had shaped so much of the valley's warmth, became gnarled with age. He was no longer the strange, isolated boy, but a respected elder. The story of the first blizzard and the mud bench became a local legend, told to wide-eyed children. The heaters, now called thorn benches, were in nearly every home, each one a testament to the quiet boy who had listened to his father. He taught his children, and then his grandchildren, the old knowledge, ensuring the journal's wisdom would not be lost. He died in his 87th year, on a cold January night, sleeping in his own bed in the warm, quiet cabin. Sarah was beside him. His passing was as peaceful as Boro's had been, a gentle release in the heart of the warmth he had created. Decades later, the valley had changed, but the cabin remained. It was preserved by the community, a small museum dedicated to a simple, revolutionary idea. The thorn bench inside it was smooth and worn, polished by the hands and lives of generations. On a crisp autumn afternoon, a young family came to visit. A woman, the great-granddaughter of one of the ranch hands Elias had sheltered so long ago, ran her hand over its surface. "They keep a small pilot light in it during the cold months," she told her son. "Just as a memorial. Feel that." The little boy, no older than 7, placed his small hand on the bench. His eyes widened. "It's warm," he whispered in awe. Outside, they walked to the small, tidy graveyard behind the cabin. They stood before a simple, weathered headstone. The engraving was faded but still legible. It did not speak of wealth or status. It said only, "Elias Thorne. He warmed the valley."